4,500 years ago, a man sat down and drove his stylus into a damp block of clay. That man had a name. That man had a mother. That man had a father. Perhaps he had a wife and children whom he was trying to support. That man had hopes, dreams, goals, fears, failures. And one day, he died. Maybe of sickness, maybe from war. A human life lost. A human who left behind marks that symbolized something so alive. The voice. Made from our breaths, intimately tied to oxygen, the substance of life. And those marks, his speech wedged into the dirt from which life itself arose, symbolized death. It symbolized a never-changing tongue, a record of a forgotten man, a bygone era, the passage of time, a language that one day faced the same death as our scribe. I've talked about mortality on this channel before, that of language and recently that of man. But mortality is a defining characteristic of life, and we often speak of languages dying. We treat languages like they're living beings, give them genetic relationships like you and your siblings descending from a line. And yet, we don't nurture and cherish them as living beings, like those of us who are gentle with life usually do. Is your speech alive in the sense of the birds that sing and the plants that grow in every crack in the concrete? Is your lexicon alive like the microbial cells on our hands? Does language, a being with no body until it's on its last ever speaker, live the way an organism does? In biology, organisms are considered alive if they perform homeostasis, have organization, metabolism, growth, adaptation, responses to stimuli, reproduction, and of course death. And I think if you stretch these definitions a little, like we do for mosquitoes, we can apply them to language. I mean, of course, language in this sense is idiolect-specific, but languages can also be imagined as concepts of mutual intelligibility for the purpose of our sociolinguistic variables. So, homeostasis, regulation of the internal environment. I think this is parallel with speaker judgments of grammaticality and mutual intelligibility. When we make utterances that we feel we have committed a speech error with, we typically correct them to clarify what we intended to communicate. If I butcher the pronunciation of a word, or use a completely incorrect grammatical function, and as such disrupt the transfer of information in states, then I have failed to regulate the internal environment of my language. Next, organisms are required to be composed of one or more cells, which are the smallest unit of life from which other ones are constructed. Similarly, I think the morpheme, the smallest linguistic unit with a lexical term or semantic referent, can be built as the cell. Single-cell organisms are like isolated morphemes. When I say bread, there's a set of baked goods that popped into your head. If I just say bruh, there's nothing. So I guess like the phoneme is the powerhouse of the cell? And then putting more morphemes together puts together larger organisms. And then saying there's bread in the fridge has a lot more meaning to it. It's multicellular, or I guess multimorphemular. In a similar vein, there's metabolism, where energy in food structures is changed to cell energy. It can be used to build larger structures, and also any metabolic waste is excreted. I think there's multiple parallels in language. When a speaker makes a speech act in a language that you know, and you understand all those words, the utterance is processed in your head and broken down as the syntactic structures emerge. You predict the upcoming words and associate the speech act with the appropriate reference. Then, you can take that information acquired from breaking down the utterance and construct your own in response, moving morphemes and clauses around, adding new things that weren't previously in the utterance but stored in your mental grammar and lexicon, and construct a new speech act. The metabolic waste parallel is when we receive stuff in an utterance that is irrelevant, we don't need to incorporate it into our own speech act, and can also just ignore or forget it. Let's say you and I are talking about Tocharian B. The entire topic of the conversation is Tocharian B. Then I say something about Italo-Celtic in the middle of an utterance concerning Tocharian B. Your response is about Tocharian B. So you just excreted Italo-Celtic. Okay, moving on. Growth is pretty simple. Language is constantly innovating. This is like basic sociolinguistics and historical linguistics. As well, the communal lexicon is ever expanding. But also your own idiolect never stops growing and morphing, learning new vocabulary already known to others, innovating new grammatical structures, implementing the Northern Cities vowel shift because I told you to, and stuff like that. Speaking of sociolinguistic growth, there's the biological process of adaptation. You adapt your pronunciation, your word choice, your grammatical structures, basically every single part of language, to social variables such as closeness with the conversation partners, respect level, age, setting, sex and gender, whether Wrexham won their last game or not, if that variable applies to you, and countless others. But also in phonology, you adapt phonemes to their environments, taking the phone to the allophone and painting camouflage onto that underlying representation. Furthermore, especially in synthetic languages, we preemptively inflect words to the morphosyntactic rules of language before saying them. That sounds pretty adaptive to me. Organisms also respond to external stimulations. The linguistic parallel has kind of already been covered, where we respond and change our speech to that of others. But I also want to mention that language can respond to external events that do not directly affect us. Specific words can arise or burst in popularity due to a single publicized or tragic event. The internet spurs this on a lot, with a recent example being the complete return of tomfoolery. But also, some languages feature taboo words, where specific words regarding a deceased leader or perhaps a religious ritual are socially unacceptable to say outside of specific contexts, and thus can almost instantly disappear from a language. And then there is the core passage of life, that of reproduction and that of death. In biology, reproduction occurs asexually and sexually. With language, it's a bit more complicated. I dislike the mother-daughter style of typological trees we do in historical linguistics, since languages are constantly influencing each other and changing together, but just play along. Languages reproduce in three main ways: divergence over a long time, so our classic example, divergence with significant substration over a shorter period of time, and creolization over a short time. Languages also die in three main ways: by fizzing out, splitting into new languages, by a community switching languages over time, or by the linguistic community itself ceasing to exist. But the nuances of those will have to wait for a future video, because there's so much I want to talk about regarding it. This video has largely been about viewing language as if it's some sort of biological structure. I don't mean to imply that in a literal sense, because language and words are knowledge, and I'm discussing and studying that knowledge, which makes me a philosopher, I guess. Perhaps this video will cement me in the books as a philosopher of language, like Richard Montague. But I don't know. This really just came from some thoughts I had whilst pondering my own mortality on a cold Wednesday night. My own death is inevitable. One day I will join the scribe in his eternal fate, whatever that may be. And in due time, so too will my tongue, the records of these utterances, the digital encodings of speech, the handwriting of syntax trees and encodings of thoughts, reference, entailments. It will all burn like fabric to the onslaught of space-time. And yet, still vestiges will remain. I will be a part of my grandchildren's grandchildren. My language will have been passed down alongside. And if I'm lucky, I'll have my own clay tablet be unearthed by the generations which we cannot yet imagine. Cherish your life. Cherish the beauty of language, too. For life is short for it as well. This video was made possible by my Patreon supporters, who keep this channel up and running with their generosity. So if you'd like to support the channel in a way other than subscribing, joining the Discord server, and that general stuff, consider joining them. Thank you to John Costello, Andrew R., Benny, Albert Jones, Acorn, Agma Schwa, Cactus, Eden, Ophiscopple, Pirate, The Wub, Selma K., Elijah, Stein G., Ayu, Andrew B., Alan, Real American Patriot, and Babalingua. Thank you for watching.